The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. We've been covering striking teachers in different parts of the country. Colorado is now, in addition to Oklahoma and California, Arizona, I believe, getting into the major teacher protests and strikes situation. And we have at the same time a proposal from some members of the Colorado State Senate for jail terms for striking teachers. And very clearly, those who are working with the teachers, participating in the strikes, saying the timing of this makes it abundantly clear what they're trying to do. They are trying to scare teachers, even though the proponents are saying, well, this isn't going to pass in time to actually jail any teachers right now. It's not a direct threat to the current strikers. It's still abundantly clear what they're trying to do here, which is to suppress dissent, constitutionally protected dissent.
Yeah, it's intimidation, that's for sure. And these teachers are actually using one of their personal days to strike. Right. They only get 2 during the course of the entire year, and they're using one of them for this. And this is clearly working. It's just working in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at these circumstances around striking, it sometimes gets muddled because a lot of people who listen to the show, they imagine situations where if they just didn't show up to work in order to strike, they would simply be fired. Yeah. And even though that might not look good for the company, there would really be no legal concerns. Teachers bargain collectively. They're represented by a union. It's a very, very different situation. So what the state senators that are proposing this are basically doing are saying, okay, so because they're represented by this union and because they are going to be using their sick days, we can't, strictly speaking, just fire them because what they're doing on their day off is striking. We are going to pass at the legal level a potential 6-month jail term for people to hope to do it, who hope to do it or plan to do it. It's a way to get around the protections of that union membership and collective bargaining.
And if anyone's doing anything illegal here, it's the state legislators themselves, actually, because in 2000 they had a referendum in Colorado, and the voters signed off on an automatic pay increase for teachers to go along with inflation.
Right.
And the state legislature just never followed through with it. They never appropriated the funds. So they're owed a backlog of like 18 years of pay raises.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course they're going on strike. They're owed that money.
I have, there's a lot of situations in government where you see a bill made into law that does something or guarantees some payment or funding for something. And then separately, the money has to be appropriated for that thing. There's really good reasons to do that. That's a check and balance in a lot of ways, where you could have a law passed and you still would in many cases want to have the recourse of not funding the law in different particular circumstances. So I sort of understand the idea. It's used to hurt people really, really often. And in fact, one of the early ways that Republicans were talking about getting in the way of Obamacare was, okay, you've made it the law, but we're going to do everything we can to prevent the appropriation or allocation of the money in order to make it happen, which will still keep it as the law, but it'll just fail miserably. And it's very similar to what's often used when there are pay raises that are agreed to, but then you still got to find the money for it. And I don't really have a strong position on any bill that makes a certain action law should implicitly and automatically appropriate the money for that, because I think that would be dangerous in many cases. At the same time, I recognize that many times the keeping separate of the law and the money to make the law happen is very problematic, and this is one of those times.
Yeah, and I think the strike will work. It's worked in other states, and just the idea of having to potentially close down schools and your kids not being able to go to classes.
Yep.
That's going to put a lot of pressure on these lawmakers. I think they ultimately will cave and give them at least half of what they're asking for.
That often is the case where there's some kind of concession made. It's rare that when it gets to this point, they get nothing, although that doesn't mean that they always get what it is that they're actually asking for. And that's
at least
the whole
they'll still
point.
have the summers off. I mean, that's pretty nice.
Yeah, they do. I mean, yeah, listen, they do have summers off, but a lot of teachers do have to work very, very late into June or even early July.
Yep.
A lot of them have to be working on stuff pretty early in August in order to be ready for a late August or early September start.
Oh,
So
yeah.
they have, quote, summers off, but teachers are working very hard.
That's a
needless to
full-time
say.
job because in addition to just teaching your classes, you're also preparing the meal plans, the lesson plans.
Right.
You're also grading papers
Sure.
after hour. Like there's a lot that goes into that.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. No disrespect whatsoever to the hard work of teachers here. Scientists are preparing to launch the world's first machine to clean up the planet's largest mass of ocean plastic, known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is sort of between Hawaii and, or I'm sorry, I pronounced it wrong, Hawaii and California, and which contains an estimated 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic. I've seen a couple documentaries about the Great Garbage Patch, and you imagine that it's actually a real mass, like you see almost like an island of plastic. The ocean is so big that it's not even really like that. It gets dense enough where if I were to take my coffee cup and fill it, I would have a ton of little plastic particles in the cup. It still wouldn't look like a mountain of plastic, but when you consider that if you keep taking those mugfuls of water, they're all filled with dozens and dozens of pieces of plastic. Given the size of the ocean, it's actually an insane amount of plastic that is in there. And the idea here is to actually be proactive in the reduction of the size of the patch, which was discovered about 21 years ago. We know that it's killing whales. We know that it's affecting the ecosystem. We know that it's doing a lot of damage when it comes to the connection between ocean acidification and other elements of climate change, as we've discussed before. This is really, really bad stuff. And the idea is that this will be a machine which will, in the ocean, be able to collect about half of the total mass of the patch in 5 years. Of course, during that time, the patch is going to continue growing. So how much of the patch that will be there in 5 years will actually be gone? You know, we have, well, my phone, I did the wrong thing. Listen to that. Wow. I'm getting 10 texts at once. Didn't silence my phone.
People don't like what you're talking about.
People don't like what I'm talking about, clearly. So this is very interesting. And we do need technology like this because at this point, just slowing down the rate at which we're damaging the planet is not going to be enough. We actually do need to be reversing some of the stuff we've done. And I think that this is great.
Yeah, and I think a student came up with this idea. He's like 23 years old. So that's pretty impressive. The image in my mind is this like long pole with like a net hanging down from it. And then every few weeks, ships will go and collect the trash. But the holes within the net are small or big enough so that fish can get through them.
Right.
Problem with that though is it inhibits your ability to like pick up the microplastic particles. And I think in some ways those are a little bit more dangerous because fish could mistake that as food. And if they mistake that as food, that's not very good for them. And also that would fulfill their hunger and they won't eat anything else.
Yeah,
So
what's
that's
happening
bad.
is fish are eating these microparticles of plastic, and then they are, quote, full, and then so they don't eat actual food, which is what they would normally be eating. That disrupts the ecosystem, but then other larger fish eat the fish that have eaten plastic, and then they are impacted by the fact that the fish has been eating plastic. So when we talk about sort of interdependent, symbiotic ecosystem, this is like a perfect example of what we mean.
So when we talk about these like proactive ways to solve the issue of climate change or at least mitigate its effects,
Yep.
do you worry that it could generate a little bit of complacency? Like we've talked about like engineering as a
Right.
way to like reflect the sunlight.
Sure.
And we talk about like this now to pick up the trash in the ocean. Does that mean that people will be like, all right, we got it taken care of. We can keep polluting at the same rate as we were before?
That's exactly my concern, which is that I am very concerned that as we develop new ways of mitigating climate change, there are people who will see it as license to just go back or continue or even increase the energy consumption that caused the problem in the first place. I genuinely don't know how you deal with that. And we've interviewed some guests who say the way you deal with that is the mitigation methods combined with more regulation. But of course, you've got a huge portion of this country who sort of at the basic political level disagrees with regulation. So I don't know how you solve that problem. But I look forward to at least some mitigation of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is just absolutely horrible.
I like both.
You like what?
It's
both
like it's an above all of the above approach.
Oh yeah,
you
we
know?
got to do it all.
You can't not mitigate the effects just because it will drive complacency. You
I
got to
completely agree. You got to do it. There has been an uproar over a Fresno State professor who tweeted out insults about Barbara Bush the night that she passed away. She has now run up against Fresno State University saying we really can't do anything about it. Rhonda Gerard is a tenured professor, at Cal State Fresno. She tweeted out that she was happy that the witch is dead and that she couldn't wait for the rest of her family to fall to their demise the way 1.5 million Iraqis have. Also adding on Twitter that Barbara Bush was a generous and smart and amazing racist who, along with her husband, raised a war criminal. And the immediate backlash led to her saying, I will never be fired. And indeed, she is not going to be fired because her employer, Fresno State President Joe Castro, confirmed that the conduct was insensitive, it was inappropriate, it was an embarrassment to the university, but they have concluded that no policies were violated. She was acting as a private citizen. She was speaking out about a public matter. No one's privacy was violated, and it was her personal Twitter account. And that even though he finds her comments disgraceful, they are protected speech under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. It's the right decision. It's the right decision. I mean, no threat was made. There's no legal issue. She has tenure. It's not a situation where you can say, if there were no tenure, then you could say, oh, as a private employer working with someone who has no tenure, we've decided that this is bad for us, so we're going to get rid of this person. This is the only way it could have gone.
So a private university probably would have canned her. I think, I don't think they would have kept her on unless like that tenure thing became an issue.
Tenure exists at private universities as well. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it might be more complex. You would have to look at for what reason can tenure be revoked, because even a private university that tries to revoke tenure can get sued just as much as a public one.
Yeah, I think the university here, though, was trying to guilt her into resigning instead because they were calling her speech disgraceful.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think she was ever going to be guilted into resigning because she said from the get-go, I'll never be fired for this.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit obnoxious, and she shouldn't have said those things, I think. I think it's a bit over the line, especially because you're talking about someone who just passed away, and people are grieving for this woman. So shouldn't have done it, but I think it's the right decision.
I think it was a bad look. I don't believe in the sort of as soon as someone dies, we look back at them with rose-colored glasses. But I do think it's okay to sort of withhold maybe the most aggressive criticisms during the time that the family is grieving. I don't know. Maybe I'm old-fashioned in that way. But for me, the real important issue here is the issue of free speech.
Yeah.
I don't like to say free speech absolutist because that now in the anti-SJW community has taken on a very particular meaning. But my view on free speech is that basically we have to defend all speech up to the point at which we are talking about direct incitements to violence and very, very sort of specific situations. And this did not meet that standard. Had tenure not been in play, the organization would have been well within its rights to make personnel decisions, for sure. But I think that because tenure was in play, I don't really think there's much of a question.
That's pretty much just going to be the standard now going forward. If you're a professor at a public university, you can say whatever you want, certainly in a private setting like Twitter is, on your own personal time, so long as you're not inciting violence, creating chaos. Like, you could be as offensive as you want, and as long as tenure doesn't get in the way, the university can't fire you.
No, I think only if tenure gets in the way, the university can't fire you. Otherwise, employers are free to use whatever they pull from the marketplace of ideas, so to speak, to make firing decisions, right?
Okay, yeah.
If you're an at-will employee without a contract and without tenure, absolutely what you say on Twitter during your private time could be used to terminate your employment. Because of tenure, that's why it wasn't able to happen here. Send me your thoughts about it. Am I missing something about the tenure Barbara Bush was racist Fresno State case? I'd be interested in hearing from you if you think I'm wrong.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.